The year is 1997. 2D video games made using pixel art are now considered outdated and have mostly been cast aside by the gaming industry. The shift to 3D game development had fully taken shape and become the focus of many companies moving forward. Major franchises like Super Mario Bros. And Final Fantasy have transitioned their worlds and characters into the third dimension, utilizing the extra power afforded to them from the newest gaming consoles to hit the market. Things are different now. However, not everyone was conforming to these new standards. One team at Konami wanted to do things differently. They wanted to create something unique, something new, something that made use of older concepts and mechanics, but applied them in a fresh, new way. And they would do so using a series that up to that point had refused to change much during the decade it had existed. A series called Castlevania. Unlike most games, Castlevania Symphony of the Night had two different directors over the course of its development. The first of which was Toru Hagihara, a talented programmer that climbed the corporate ladder and eventually took over as head of his division. The second is Koji Igarashi, or just Iga as he is often credited, a man whose name is now synonymous with the Castlevania series. Our story begins in the early 1980s, long before video games had become the media powerhouse they are today. A teenage Igarashi was enamored when he saw an arcade game called Crazy Climber running on his friend's computer. He became enthralled with the idea of learning to make his own video games, but his family was not able to afford a PC. This did not deter him though, and he taught himself basic programming by alternating between a friend's PC and an in-store display model at a local electronics store. He continued to hone his skills as a programmer throughout his years in college, and shortly after graduating he was hired by Konami, a publisher and developer that by this point in time had already established itself in the video game industry. He began his days at Konami programming for fan favorites like Twinbee and Gradius 2, before later being brought on to also do scenario writing for a dating simulation game exclusive to Japan known as Tokimeki Memorial. Igarashi did good work on the game, but he was not passionate about it, and this frustrated him. During development of Tokimeki Memorial, Igarashi's girlfriend at the time, who would later become his wife, was working on a new Castlevania title called Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine CD. He was much more interested in her game than his own and would regularly sneak into her office to play through parts of it as an escape from his frustrations. Once development had wrapped up on Tokimeki Memorial, the game became a hit and Igarashi's boss wanted him to work on a sequel. Igarashi was finally honest about his lack of passion for the game and pleaded to be put on a different project. His excellent work on the title, plus its success, gave him some leverage, and his superiors gave in and allowed him to move to a different development team. Excitedly, Igarashi looked through all of Konami's projects, and his eyes met with a familiar title, Akumajo Dracula, or Castlevania as the series is known in the West. This new development team Igarashi joined was not working on Symphony of the Night, but instead a spin-off Castlevania game for Sega's 32X console add-on known as The Bloodletting, with Toru Hagihara at the helm as director and Igarashi in charge of the title's writing and programming. This game was never finished though, as the 32X ended up being a financial flop. Konami decided to cancel it and focus more on Sony's new PlayStation console. The team went back to the drawing board and decided to make some changes to their initial concepts for The Bloodletting, and pitched the game as a different title with some new ideas. Since this game was seen by Konami as a spin-off title in the Castlevania series, they were much more open to Hagihara making big changes to the core concepts and mechanics, at least within reason. The team had two major goals they wanted to accomplish. First, increase the game's length by giving players a less linear gameplay experience and allowing them to explore. And second, make the game more accessible to people that did not have the patience for the Castlevania series' tough difficulty bar. Luckily for them, a Castlevania game like this had already been made, at least in a sense.
Wow.
Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, an open-ended non-linear game with light RPG elements, was instrumental for the team proving to the executives at Konami that the type of Castlevania experience they wanted to make could be successful. Without Castlevania II's existence, it is very likely Symphony of the Night would have never happened. And with that, the team began on its development. The The game would take place as a direct sequel to 1993's Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which Hagihara had been the director of. But rather than maintain its prequel's more linear level design, the team would take inspiration from Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda series with its more open-ended exploration and create a massive castle for players to traverse through. Graphically, the game would utilize the PlayStation's extra power and storage to make some of the most gorgeous 2D pixel art the world had ever seen and bring character designer Ayami Kojima's immaculate artwork to life. Symphony of the Night would retain the side-scrolling, action-based gameplay the Castlevania series had been known for, but its new main character was not a whip-wielding Belmont like in all the previous games. Instead, you take control of Alucard, a half-human, half-vampire that is the son of the series' infamous antagonist, Dracula, and wields swords instead of whips. This would not be Alucard's first appearance in a Castlevania game, however, as he was first playable as a secondary character in Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse. In Symphony of the Night, though, he would play very differently and have access to a large amount of various combat and traversal skills, like transforming into a wolf and using special boots to fling himself vertically through the air. As players acquired these skills, access to different areas of the castle would slowly become available, especially in places that had already been explored, rewarding you for backtracking and searching every nook and cranny in Dracula's expansive stronghold. With the team's first goal well on its way to fruition, they still had to figure out a way to solve their second one, making the game a bit more accessible to people previously turned away by the series' notorious difficulty. For this, they looked to the role-playing game genre and its popular titles like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest for inspiration. They gave Alucard different stat values like hit points and defense, which allowed him to get stronger and increase these values by killing enemies and gaining experience points. This would allow players that were having difficulty progressing through certain areas to eventually gain the power they needed to move forward and continue on through the game. Not only were stats and levels added, but different weapons, armor, and accessories were hidden throughout the castle that could be collected and equipped, giving Alucard even more stat boosts as well as different abilities and attributes. Some weapons even had hidden moves and traits. The team early on in development even had a dark and holy alignment system in place, where using sub-weapons would gain you holy alignment and casting magic would gain dark alignment. These alignments would have even affected the game's ending. However, the team eventually decided to scrap this system, though sub-weapons and magic spells still remained. Sub-weapons worked similar to the previous Castlevania games, where you could pick up and utilize different items like daggers, holy water, and axes at the expense of using up hearts, a currency collected from destroying candles and enemies. Magic worked a bit differently though. Alucard had to make use of magic points that were represented by a blue bar at the top of the screen, which gradually refilled over time. To cast spells, you'd need to enter in a specific button combination, similar to how you would execute a Hadouken Fireball in Street Fighter II, a quarter circle forward motion and a certain button press at the end. Almost every spell is available to you at the start of the game. You just need to have enough magic points and the dexterity to actually cast them. The final mechanic to be added into the game was the familiar system, which allowed Alucard to equip a familiar, a non-human creature like a bat or ghost, that could gain levels and assist him both with combat and uncovering hidden inaccessible areas. Familiars barely made it into the game though, as it was hastily added towards the end of development and just narrowly avoided being removed completely. While the gameplay systems were incredibly important, Symphony of the Night needed one more thing to tie everything together, something every Castlevania game up to that point had prided itself on: an incredible soundtrack. Michiru Yamane was given this daunting job, fresh off of just finishing her very first Castlevania soundtrack, Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis. She poured everything she had into this task and created a musical masterpiece that tapped into a massive amount of different music genres, ranging from classical to metal, and from gothic rock to jazz. The soundtrack for Symphony of the Night was absolutely in talented, capable hands. Hagihara, Igarashi, and the rest of the team had their roadmap in place, but a big change was coming, a change that would affect Igarashi for the rest of his life. As development on Symphony of the Night was moving along, Hagihara received big news from Konami. They were promoting him and he would take over as head of the entire development division. It was a large step up from his current position and came with a much bigger set of responsibilities. Hagihara in his new role would have a tough time keeping up with his new tasks and directing an ambitious title like Symphony of the Night. He had been impressed with Igarashi's work so far and decided to offer him the chance to take over as assistant director to oversee the rest of the game's development. Igarashi had looked up to Hagihara as a mentor figure and had learned a lot from him about how to delegate tasks and balance workloads very efficiently and effectively. Igarashi graciously accepted the job and got to work immediately, excited to make his directorial debut on a work he felt so passionate about. Igarashi and his team pressed on with development, working themselves to the bone and spending hours each week laboring away at their desks well into the night, past when most other dev teams had already gone home. Even with all of the grueling work, they were creating something that they were passionate about, something that kept them inspired and motivated. They were going in a different direction than the rest of the gaming industry, and that was perfectly okay. Igarashi kept the project moving along well and even began to implement some other new ideas that him and the team had come up with. Since the game was a direct sequel to a previous Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood, they wanted to try and make the story transition even smoother by having you start off Symphony of the Night by playing through its prequel's finale, fighting Dracula right off the bat as Rondo of Blood's main protagonist, Richter Belmont. There was a much bigger focus on story than in previous titles, and Alucard would have conversations with both his comrades and adversaries that advanced the story throughout his adventure. At one point in development, the game was planned to have many other characters and interactions. However, most of these were removed as Igarashi felt that they interrupted the game's flow and progression way too much. As noted earlier, providing players with a lot more gameplay time and giving them a large castle that offered plenty of exploration was a big part of the team's main goals. Even with the size of the castle they had, they still wanted to expand it and allow for more exploration. It was at this point that a member on the team suggested that they make a second castle by simply flipping the original one over. This would allow for them to double the game's size without having to create many additional assets. They would just need to make some new enemies and change the story a bit to accommodate this new brilliant idea. And with that, the inverted castle was born, one of the game's most defining and memorable features. This second castle was hidden so well that a person could potentially finish the game without knowing of its existence and miss out on well over half of the game. A risky gamble for sure, but risky gambles are what made Symphony of the Night the masterpiece that it was. Similar to the game's second castle, another aspect the team focused on was adding a ton of small details and references that could easily be missed by players without accidentally stumbling onto or actively looking for them. Here are a few of them. Summoning the shields from Gradius and the dragons from Life Force with a shield rod. Alucard falling asleep when you sit in a chair. Enemies reacting to you killing their animal partner. The Power of Sire item showing a picture of the real-life Vlad Tepes, who Dracula is actually based on. Alucard remembering Trevor Belmont's NES sprite from Castlevania 3. Fighting all of Castlevania 1's original bosses. Yellow Medusa head sometimes turning Alucard into a gargoyle statue. When using a peanut, having to actually catch it in your mouth to restore HP. The Venus Weed enemy turning from blue to red as it feeds on Alucard's blood. Watching a family of birds hatch and slowly grow up after returning several times through their nest in the outer wall. The main villain from Kid Dracula, Galamoth, showing up as a boss. The rune sword spelling out the German word verboten when it is thrown. Monsters appearing and rattling on the bars in their prison cells when you approach them in Ulrox's quarters. Skelerang's cowering and refusing to attack if you get too close. And Alucard's bat familiar falling in love when he transforms into a bat and getting confused when he changes back. Plus, many, many more. If anyone ever claimed that Castlevania Symphony of the Night was not a labor of love, they clearly were not picking up on all the minute details added by an incredibly passionate team. Even years later in modern-day games, it is a rarity to see so much attention to small details. The team didn't know it at the time, but all of this passion and effort would lead to the creation of one of the most special and revered games of all time. In early 1997, Castlevania Symphony of the Night finally hit Japanese store shelves under the title Akumajo Dracula X: Nocturne in the Moonlight. It included a special prelude manga comic illustrated by the game's character designer, Ayami Kojima, as well as a CD soundtrack containing music from previous Castlevania titles. The game released to somewhat lukewarm sales, and it started to look like the game may not ever leave Japan. Konami did end up coming through, however. Well, kind of. Symphony of the Night would eventually launch later that same year in North America and Europe, but the game's localization and marketing budgets were incredibly minuscule, especially for the time, and the game flew under many people's radar. The game had very mediocre sales initially, but as time went on, word of mouth spread about the game's quality, and sales began to gradually rise. In 1998, exclusive to Japan, Konami released the Sega Saturn version of Symphony of the Night that included additional areas to explore and bosses to fight. Maria Renard was also made a playable character alongside Richter Belmont, although Richter was already playable in the PlayStation version after completing the game. While this version included a good amount of extra content, the game's poorer graphics quality and long loading times kept it from becoming the definitive version. Over the years, Symphony of the Night saw various other re-releases for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation Portable, and iOS and Android devices. It even received its own puzzle game titled Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night exclusively for iPhone and iPad that used mini sprites from the game. Even though Symphony of the Night did not start out very successful, it certainly continued on strong and impacted the Castlevania series in a way no one saw coming. After Symphony of the Night, the Castlevania series tried its hand at the 3D platforming genre that many of its other competing franchises had already made the transition to. It did not go very smoothly.
Not like this. Not like this.
While Konami did not give up on moving Castlevania into 3D during the PlayStation 2 era, it did begin to see that Symphony of the Night's epic 2D adventure was finally catching on with fans and newcomers of the series. Over the next decade, they began to put out Castlevania games on Nintendo's handheld consoles, the Game Boy Advance and DS, that utilized many of Symphony of the Night's concepts and framework. Most of these titles were overseen by Igarashi and began releasing so frequently that they were almost becoming annualized. As these types of games began to become more frequent, fans of them would create a new subgenre called Metroidvania. The name fused Nintendo's popular Metroid series, known for its 2D open-ended exploration, and the second part of Castlevania's title, so that any games released that shared their similar qualities could be identified with a much simpler word. While you'd think it was a good thing that Konami was pumping out Symphony of the Night-like Castlevania titles, one thing became very apparent to fans. These new Castlevanias just didn't quite meet the quality of the original game. These games are still considered by many to be quite good, but they were being churned out so fast and receiving smaller and smaller budgets that it was starting to burn out and fatigue both its fans and Igarashi. It became apparent that he would never be able to fill the big shoes left behind by Symphony of the Night, especially with the lack of time and development budget he had been receiving. So in 2014, Igarashi made the difficult decision to leave Konami and set out as an independent developer. Shortly after that, he launched a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign for a spiritual successor to his previous Castlevania titles called Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night, which ended up raising $5.5 million, making it the most successful crowdfunded game of all time up to that point. The game released in 2019 to favorable reviews and was considered a success both sales-wise and by fans of the Castlevania series. It showed that Igarashi's career as a successful game designer was far from over, and that having Symphony of the Night on your resume could be a pretty powerful tool. When Igarashi, Hagihara, and the rest of the team began development on Symphony of the Night, they had no idea that it was going to redefine a genre and change a series that up to that point had remained firm in its core gameplay ideas and mechanics. They had no idea they were going to accidentally create a subgenre that would continue to be used for years and years to come and inspire countless other developers to try and build on what they had done. While many of the large, expensive 3D games that had been releasing in the late 1990s were incredibly fun and even groundbreaking, Symphony of the Night wanted to move in its own direction and show that there was still life and passion left in pixel art in the 2D side-scrolling genre that many people had been slowly beginning to bury as a relic of the past. It was a game that broke through the modern trends and became an irreplaceable piece of video game history. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is my favorite game of all time. Doesn't seem that long ago, back in 1997, when a young little me walked up to the video game rental store and rented a copy of Symphony of the Night and was just blown away completely by the amazing soundtrack, the graphics, the exploration, the RPG elements, just every little minute detail that they had added into that game. So once again, thanks again for watching, and if you haven't played this game, please go buy it. It's available on a ton of different platforms, and it is just incredible from top to bottom. So thanks, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye. Hey, thanks for... Okay.